Liwayway had never imagined her best friend Bettina would put her in such an awkward position. The evening was meant to be a simple night of celebration, filled with laughter and drinks, but it quickly turned into something else entirely. Bettina, already drunk and giggling, turned to her boyfriend, Marvin, and pleaded with him to take Liwayway home. "Marvin, please, can you take her? I can't sleep unless I know she gets home safely," Bettina slurred, her voice thick with alcohol. Marvin sighed, clearly reluctant, and cast a glance at Liwayway, who sat slumped on the sofa. Her usually composed demeanor was nowhere to be seen as she fought against the haze of intoxication. "Babe, are you sure? She could just stay the night here," Marvin reasoned. "Please, babe. She's my best friend." Marvin couldn't argue further. With a heavy sigh, he nodded and stood up. "All right, let's go," he muttered. Liwayway attempted to rise but immediately stumbled, her legs betraying her. Marvin, clearly frustrated but unable to leave her like that, bent down and scooped her up into his arms. She murmured something incoherent as he carried her out to his car, but her words were lost in the fog of alcohol. When they reached the car, Marvin opened the back door, intending to settle her in the back seat, but Liwayway, stubborn even in her drunken state, climbed into the front seat instead. "Fine," Marvin muttered under his breath as he walked around to the driver's side and got in. The drive was quiet, save for the occasional sound of Marvin sighing. He was tired, having spent hours traveling from Manila earlier in the day, and now, on top of that, he was tasked with chauffeuring Bettina's best friend. Liwayway had fallen asleep again, her head lolling to the side. Marvin's eyes flicked toward her briefly before returning to the road. For the first time, he noticed details about her he hadn't before. How her long lashes framed her closed eyes, how her soft features made her look almost ethereal. But then his gaze dropped further, and he realized the top button of her blouse had come undone, revealing the pale curve of her collarbone. He immediately scolded himself, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Get it together, Marvin," he muttered under his breath. This was Bettina's best friend, for crying out loud. And not only that, she was Elmer's girlfriend, a fact that made his momentary lapse of judgment even worse. But he couldn't help but remember the time he'd caught Liwayway watching him and Bettina. The memory surfaced unbidden. The way her eyes had lingered too long, her cheeks flushed as though she had stumbled upon something she wasn't meant to see. Marvin shook his head, trying to banish the thought. When they arrived at the gated Altamero estate, Liwayway stirred awake. One of the guards at the gate recognized her immediately and waved them through without question. "Stop here," Liwayway said suddenly, her voice quiet but firm. Marvin glanced at her, confused. "We're not even at your house yet." "I said stop," she repeated, her tone sharper this time. Marvin hesitated but complied, pulling the car to the side of the road. The area was dark and secluded, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon above. Liwayway didn't move to get out. Instead, she sat there silently, her hands trembling in her lap. Tears began to stream down Liwayway's face, her quiet sobs filling the silence of the car. Marvin turned to her, concern replacing the frustration he had felt earlier. "Hey, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice softer now. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she unbuttoned another button of her blouse, her trembling hands revealing more of her porcelain skin. Marvin's eyes widened in shock. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Liwayway's tear-streaked face turned to him, her eyes filled with anguish. I thought this was what I needed to do," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Elmer said, he said I wasn't enough. That if I couldn't give him what he wanted, then there was no point in staying together." Marvin's chest tightened. He could hear the pain in her voice, the weight of her heartbreak heavy in the air. "That's not love, Liwayway," he said firmly. "If Elmer made you feel like you have to do this to keep him, then he's an idiot." Liwayway broke into sobs, her small frame trembling with the force of her emotions. Marvin hesitated for a moment before reaching out and pulling her into his arms. She clung to him, burying her face in his shoulder as her tears soaked his shirt. For a moment, Marvin let himself hold her, his protective instincts overriding the voice in his head warning him that this was crossing a line. But as the seconds ticked by, the weight of the situation pressed down on him. "This isn't the way," he said quietly, pulling back just enough to look at her tear-streaked face. "You're worth more than this, Liwayway. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Liwayway looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something. Validation, understanding, comfort. She nodded slowly, her tears still falling. Marvin started the car again and drove the rest of the way to her house in silence. But the air between them was heavy with unspoken words and emotions neither of them fully understood. As Liwayway stepped out of the car and into the darkness, Marvin couldn't shake the feeling that something between them had shifted. And while he didn't know what it meant, he knew one thing for certain: he was in trouble. Liwayway woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside her window. The sun's rays filtered through the curtains, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. But as the events of the previous night rushed back to her, a heavy weight settled on her chest. She sat up slowly, her head pounding from the alcohol, and her heart aching from the confrontation with Elmer. Her reflection in the mirror caught her attention, and she noticed her swollen eyes and tear-streaked cheeks. The memory of Marvin's words echoed in her mind. "You're worth more than this. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Her lips quivered as she replayed his unexpected kindness. Marvin had always been Bettina's boyfriend, someone she kept at arm's length. But last night, for the first time, she saw a side of him that made her feel seen and understood. Shaking her head, she pushed the thought away. It wasn't right to think about Marvin like that, not when he belonged to her best friend. Downstairs, her mother, Elena, was busy in the kitchen. The scent of fried rice and eggs wafted through the air. Liwayway hesitated before joining her, unsure if she could face her family after her emotional breakdown the night before. "Good morning, Anik," Elena greeted, her tone light but observant. "You came home late last night. Is everything okay?" Liwayway forced a smile. "Yes, Ma. I was just with Bettina and her boyfriend. Marvin dropped me off." Her mother raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "Well, eat your breakfast. You look like you need it." Liwayway nodded and sat at the table, though her appetite was nowhere to be found. Her mind was still on Elmer. Was it really over? Was their love not enough for him? Later that afternoon, Liwayway decided to take a walk around the Altamero estate to clear her mind. The sprawling grounds were peaceful, with neatly trimmed hedges and blooming flowers lining the pathways. She was lost in thought when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Liwayway." She turned abruptly, her breath catching in her throat as she saw Marvin approaching. He was dressed casually in a fitted white shirt and jeans, his presence both unexpected and unnerving. "What are you doing here?" she asked, trying to sound indifferent. "I came to check on you," he said simply. "After last night, I wanted to make sure you were okay." Liwayway's cheeks flushed. "You didn't have to do that. I'm fine." Marvin crossed his arms, his gaze steady. "You don't look fine." His directness caught her off guard. She opened her mouth to protest but found herself unable to form the words. Instead, she looked away, her hands clenching at her sides. "Liwayway," Marvin said softly, stepping closer. "You don't have to pretend with me. I know you're hurting." Tears threatened to spill again, but she blinked them away. "Why do you care, Marvin? I'm not your problem." "Because Bettina cares about you," he replied, though his tone held something deeper. "And because no one deserves to feel like they're not enough." Liwayway's resolve crumbled, and she let out a shaky breath. "He left me," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Elmer left me because I wouldn't give him what he wanted." Marvin's jaw tightened. "Then he's an idiot." Her eyes widened, startled by his bluntness. "Any man who truly loves you wouldn't pressure you into doing something you're not ready for," he continued. "You deserve someone who respects you, Liwayway. Don't ever settle for less." His words hit her like a tidal wave, and for a moment, all she could do was stare at him. How was it that Marvin, someone she barely knew beyond his connection to Bettina, could say exactly what she needed to hear? "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling. Marvin gave her a small nod. "Take care of yourself, okay?" As he walked away, Liwayway felt a strange mix of emotions: gratitude, confusion, and something she couldn't quite name. That night, Liwayway lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her mind was a whirlwind of memories and emotions. She thought about Elmer, about the promises he had made and the way he had made her feel loved, only to shatter her heart in the end. But more than that, she found herself thinking about Marvin. His words had been so kind, so genuine, and the way he had looked at her, it was as if he truly cared. "No," she whispered to herself, "I can't think like this." Marvin was Bettina's boyfriend, and she had no right to let her thoughts linger on him. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the memory of his steady gaze and reassuring voice. The following day, Bettina called her. "Hey, bestie," Bettina chirped, her tone as bubbly as ever. "How are you feeling?" "I'm okay," Liwayway replied, forcing a smile she knew Bettina couldn't see. "Good. I told Marvin to check on you yesterday. Did he?" Liwayway's heart skipped a beat. "He did. Thank you." "Of course. You're my best friend, and Marvin's a sweetheart. I knew he'd take good care of you." Liwayway's stomach twisted with guilt. Bettina trusted her completely, and yet here she was, harboring thoughts she had no right to feel. As the call ended, Liwayway vowed to bury her feelings and focus on healing from Elmer. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the growing connection between her and Marvin. A connection that felt as dangerous as it was undeniable. The days that followed were a blur for Liwayway. She avoided Bettina's calls and kept herself busy helping her mother at home. But no matter how much she tried to distract herself, the memory of Marvin lingered in her mind like an echo she couldn't silence. Bettina noticed her friend's sudden withdrawal. "Bestie, what's going on with you?" Bettina asked one afternoon when she showed up unannounced at Liwayway's house. Liwayway froze mid-sentence, caught off guard by her best friend's directness. "I've just been busy," she lied, forcing a weak smile. Bettina wasn't convinced. "Busy with what? You've been dodging me for days." Liwayway's chest tightened with guilt. She knew Bettina didn't deserve to be pushed away, but every time they spoke, she felt a sharp pang of guilt about her growing thoughts of Marvin. "I'm sorry," Liwayway said softly, her voice breaking. "I'm just going through something." Bettina's expression softened, and she wrapped her arms around Liwayway in a comforting embrace. "You can tell me anything, Liwa. I'm here for you." Liwayway bit her lip, holding back the urge to cry. She couldn't bring herself to confess the truth, not when Bettina trusted her so much. A week later, Liwayway found herself wandering the local market. It was her favorite place to clear her head, with its vibrant stalls and the aroma of freshly cooked street food filling the air. As she browsed through a stall selling handmade jewelry, a familiar voice called her name. "Liwayway." She turned around, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Marvin standing a few feet away. He was carrying a plastic bag of groceries, looking effortlessly handsome in a plain white shirt and jeans. "Marvin," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He approached her, his expression warm but cautious. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Me neither," she replied awkwardly, clutching the strap of her bag. There was a brief silence before Marvin broke it. "How have you been?" "I'm fine," she lied, avoiding his gaze. Marvin frowned, clearly unconvinced. "You don't look fine." Liwayway's shoulders sagged, and she let out a sigh. "I'm trying to be." Marvin hesitated for a moment before speaking. "If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here. I mean it." His sincerity made her chest tighten. She wanted to tell him everything, to pour out her heart and admit how lost she felt, but she couldn't. "Thank you," she said quietly. Marvin nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer before he excused himself. As he walked away, Liwayway couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and regret. That evening, Liwayway sat on the balcony of her room, staring at the stars. The cool breeze kissed her skin, but it did little to soothe the storm brewing in her heart. She couldn't deny the way her chest fluttered whenever Marvin was near, or the way his words stayed with her long after he was gone. But every time she thought of him, guilt clawed at her insides. He was Bettina's boyfriend. He wasn't hers to think about, let alone feel anything for. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing. It was a message from Bettina. "Hey bestie, Marvin and I are planning a weekend trip to the beach. You should come. It'll be fun." Smiling face with smiling eyes. Liwayway stared at the message, her heart pounding. The idea of spending an entire weekend with Bettina and Marvin felt like walking into a minefield, but she didn't know how to say no without arousing suspicion. After a moment of hesitation, she replied, "Sure, sounds fun." The moment she sent the message, she regretted it. The days leading up to the trip were a whirlwind of anxiety for Liwayway. She tried to convince herself that everything would be fine, that she could keep her feelings in check, but deep down, she knew she was walking a dangerous path. When the weekend arrived, Bettina picked her up with Marvin in tow. The three of them piled into Marvin's car, and the tension in the air was palpable. "Excited for the beach?" Bettina asked cheerfully, oblivious to the storm brewing within her best friend. Liwayway forced a smile. "Yeah, I guess." Marvin glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. Liwayway quickly looked away, focusing on the scenery outside the window. As they drove towards the beach, Liwayway couldn't shake the feeling that this trip would change everything. The salty breeze kissed Liwayway's face as they arrived at the beach resort. The sun hung low in the sky, painting everything in hues of gold and orange. Bettina was practically bouncing with excitement as they unloaded their bags from the car. Marvin, ever the gentleman, carried most of the luggage, his muscles flexing subtly under his shirt, a detail Liwayway found herself noticing far more than she should. "Bestie, this place is amazing," Bettina exclaimed, looping her arm through Liwayway's as they walked towards their rented villa. Liwayway nodded, her smile thin. She was trying her best to keep her emotions in check, but every stolen glance at Marvin threatened to shatter her composure. Inside the villa, the girls shared a room while Marvin took the room next door. After settling in, Bettina suggested they go for a walk along the shore before dinner. As they strolled along the beach, Bettina chatted animatedly about the upcoming plans for her career and future with Marvin. Liwayway listened silently, her chest tightening with every word. She tried to focus on the sound of the waves, but her thoughts kept circling back to the man walking a few steps ahead of them. When Bettina ran off to chase a crab scuttling near the water, Marvin slowed his pace to fall in step with Liwayway. "You've been quiet," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm just tired," she replied, keeping her gaze on the horizon. Marvin studied her for a moment, as if trying to read her thoughts. "If something's bothering you, you can tell me." Liwayway forced a small laugh. "You always say that." "Because I mean it," he said firmly. "You don't have to carry everything alone." His words struck a chord deep within her, and for a moment, she felt an overwhelming urge to spill everything, to tell him about her heartbreak, her confusion, her feelings for him. But before she could say anything, Bettina called out to them, breaking the moment. Dinner that night was a lively affair. Bettina ordered seafood platters, and they ate on the villa's veranda under the stars. Bettina, who had indulged in a few too many glasses of wine, became the life of the party, laughing and joking with Marvin while Liwayway tried to stay invisible. After dinner, Bettina decided to retire early, leaving Marvin and Liwayway alone. The silence between them was thick, and Liwayway felt the weight of his gaze as they cleaned up the table together. "Do you want to go for a walk?" Marvin asked suddenly. Liwayway hesitated, but eventually nodded. "Sure." They walked along the moonlit shore, the only sounds coming from the waves crashing against the sand. For the first time, it felt like they were truly alone, free from Bettina's watchful eyes. "I didn't think you'd agree," Marvin said, breaking the silence. "Why not?" "You've been avoiding me," he said bluntly. Liwayway's breath hitched. She opened her mouth to deny it, but stopped herself. There was no point in lying. "I've just had a lot on my mind." "Like what?" he pressed. She hesitated, debating how much to reveal. "It's hard to explain." Marvin stopped walking and turned to face her. "Try me." The sincerity in his voice made her heart ache. For a moment, she considered telling him everything, but the thought of hurting Bettina held her back. "It's nothing," she said softly, looking away. Marvin stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Liwayway." She looked up at him, and the intensity in his eyes made her stomach flip. For a moment, it felt like the rest of the world had faded away, leaving only the two of them. "I don't know what's going on with you, but whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Her resolve crumbled, and before she could stop herself, tears spilled down her cheeks. Marvin hesitated for a moment before pulling her into a gentle hug. Liwayway's heart raced as she felt the warmth of his arms around her. She knew this was dangerous, that she was crossing a line she could never uncross, but in that moment, she didn't care. The next morning, Liwayway woke up with a heavy heart. The memory of Marvin's embrace haunted her, and she felt a mix of guilt and longing she couldn't shake. Bettina, oblivious to the tension, suggested they go kayaking. Marvin agreed, and the three of them spent the morning paddling through the calm waters of the bay. Liwayway tried to act normal, but every time she looked at Marvin, her emotions threatened to overwhelm her. She couldn't understand why she was feeling this way. She had no right to want him. Not when he belonged to someone else, not when that someone was her best friend. That evening, Bettina suggested they play a drinking game. As the night wore on and the alcohol flowed, the atmosphere grew more relaxed, but Liwayway couldn't shake the growing tension between her and Marvin. At one point, Bettina excused herself to take a call, leaving Marvin and Liwayway alone once again. "You've been quiet," Marvin said, pouring himself another drink. Liwayway forced a smile. "Just tired." He studied her for a moment, his gaze piercing. "Is that all it is?" She looked away, unable to meet his eyes. What else would it be? Marvin leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I don't know. You tell me." Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to tell him to stop, to remind him that this was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Before she could respond, Bettina returned, her laughter filling the room and breaking the tension. Liwayway felt a wave of relief and guilt wash over her. As the night went on, she couldn't help but wonder how much longer she could keep up this charade. The beach resort felt less like a retreat and more like a battlefield as tension mounted between Liwayway and Marvin. The day after the drinking game, Bettina, blissfully unaware of the undercurrents between her boyfriend and best friend, suggested they explore the nearby hiking trail. Liwayway reluctantly agreed, and the three of them set out on the steep path that wound through lush greenery and led to a picturesque waterfall. Bettina skipped ahead, snapping photos and calling for Marvin to join her. He did, but his glances kept straying to Liwayway, who lagged behind. At one point, Bettina ran ahead to chase a butterfly, leaving Liwayway and Marvin alone once more. The sound of the waterfall grew louder as they walked, and the air between them grew thick with unspoken words. "You're quiet again," Marvin said, his tone laced with concern. Liwayway forced a smile, just enjoying the view. But Marvin wasn't fooled. He stopped walking and gently took her arm, forcing her to look at him. "Liwayway, what's going on with you? You've been acting strange since we got here." She swallowed hard, her pulse quickening at his touch. "Nothing's wrong." "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice firm but soft. "I can tell something's bothering you. Is it Bettina? Did she say something?" Liwayway shook her head, tears threatening to spill. She wanted to tell him the truth, to confess everything, but the thought of betraying Bettina held her back. Instead, She pulled away from him and started walking again. "I'm fine," she said over her shoulder. "Let's just catch up with Bettina." That evening, the trio decided to have a bonfire on the beach. Bettina was her usual bubbly self, roasting marshmallows and telling funny stories from their college days. Liwayway laughed along, but her heart wasn't in it. Marvin, too, seemed distracted, his gaze flickering to Liwayway whenever Bettina wasn't looking. After an hour, Bettina excused herself, claiming she was tired and wanted to rest. She urged Liwayway and Marvin to stay and enjoy the fire, completely oblivious to the growing storm between them. The moment Bettina left, the atmosphere shifted. The crackling fire cast shadows on Marvin's face, making his expression unreadable. Liwayway avoided his gaze, staring at the flames as if they held the answers to her turmoil. "You can't keep avoiding me forever," Marvin said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "I'm not avoiding you," she replied, though even she didn't believe her own words. "Liwayway, look at me," he said, his tone commanding yet gentle. She hesitated before finally meeting his eyes. The intensity in his gaze made her breath hitch. "Why won't you talk to me?" he asked, leaning closer. Liwayway felt her resolve crumbling. "Because it doesn't matter. None of this matters." "It matters to me," he said firmly. His words struck a chord deep within her, and before she could stop herself, the tears she had been holding back spilled over. Marvin reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek as he wiped away her tears. "You don't have to carry this alone," he said softly. For a moment, it felt like the rest of the world had disappeared. Liwayway could feel the warmth of his hand on her face, the steadiness of his gaze. She wanted to believe him, to let herself fall into his arms, but the image of Bettina's smiling face flashed in her mind, snapping her back to reality. "I can't do this," she whispered, pulling away. "I can't." Before Marvin could respond, she stood up and walked away, leaving him alone by the fire. The following morning, the tension between Liwayway and Marvin was palpable. Bettina, oblivious as always, suggested they spend their last day at the resort relaxing by the pool. Liwayway tried to act normal, but every time Marvin looked at her, she felt like he could see right through her. She avoided his gaze, focusing all her attention on Bettina, who was busy sunbathing and scrolling through her phone. As the day wore on, Bettina suggested they take one last walk along the beach before heading back to the city. Marvin agreed, but Liwayway made an excuse, claiming she wasn't feeling well. "I'll stay with you," Marvin offered, but Bettina waved him off. "No, it's fine. Go ahead, babe. I'll take care of her." Reluctantly, Marvin left with Bettina, leaving Liwayway alone in the villa. She sat on the couch, staring out the window as the waves crashed against the shore. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She knew she couldn't go on like this, pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. She had to make a decision. Either confess her feelings to Marvin and risk everything, or bury them deep inside and move on. When Marvin and Bettina returned, Liwayway avoided them, claiming she was tired and needed to rest. But later that night, as she lay in bed, she heard a soft knock on her door. "Liwayway, it's me," Marvin's voice came through the door. She froze, her heart pounding. "Can we talk?" he asked. She hesitated before getting up and opening the door. Marvin stood there, his expression a mix of determination and concern. "We can't keep pretending nothing's wrong," he said. "We need to talk about this." Liwayway shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "There's nothing to talk about." "Yes, there is," he insisted. "I don't know what's happening between us, but I can't ignore it anymore." "Marvin, please," she pleaded. "Just leave it alone." "I can't," he said, stepping closer. "I care about you, Liwayway, more than I should." His words shattered the last of her defenses. She felt her knees go weak, and before she knew it, Marvin had pulled her into his arms. For a moment, they stood there, holding onto each other as if the world outside didn't exist. But the sound of Bettina's laughter from the next room brought them crashing back to reality. Liwayway pulled away, her eyes filled with regret. "This is wrong," she whispered. Marvin looked at her, his expression pained. "I know." Without another word, she turned and walked back into her room, closing the door behind her. The trip back to the city was suffocating for Liwayway. She sat in the back seat of Marvin's car while Bettina chattered happily in the front, oblivious to the emotional storm brewing between her boyfriend and best friend. Every laugh Bettina let out, every affectionate glance she threw at Marvin, was like a knife twisting in Liwayway's chest. Marvin, for his part, was unusually quiet. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. Liwayway could see the tension in his jaw every time Bettina leaned over to show him something on her phone. He would nod or mumble a reply, but his gaze would inevitably flicker to the rearview mirror, where their eyes would meet for a fleeting second before she quickly looked away. When they finally arrived at Bettina's apartment, she invited Liwayway to stay the night, but Liwayway declined, claiming she had work to prepare for. She didn't trust herself to be around Marvin any longer than necessary. "I'll call you tomorrow," Bettina said as she hugged Liwayway. Liwayway forced a smile and nodded, her heart aching as she watched Bettina kiss Marvin goodbye. Later that night, as Liwayway lay in her bed, she replayed the events of the trip over and over in her mind. She knew she had to put distance between herself and Marvin, for her sake and Bettina's, but the thought of never seeing him again was unbearable. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Marvin. "Marvin, can we talk?" She stared at the message, her heart pounding. She knew she should ignore it, but her fingers betrayed her. "There's nothing to talk about." His reply came almost immediately. "Please, just one conversation. I need to understand what's happening between us." Liwayway hesitated for a long moment before typing her response. "Fine, tomorrow." The next evening, Marvin picked Liwayway up from her apartment. The car ride was silent, tension hanging thick in the air. Marvin drove them to a secluded park on the outskirts of the city, where they could talk without fear of being overheard. They sat on a bench under a large tree, the glow of the streetlights casting soft shadows around them. For a while, neither of them spoke. Marvin was the first to break the silence. "I don't know when it started," he said, his voice low, "but I can't stop thinking about you, Liwayway." Her breath caught in her throat. She had expected this, but hearing him say it out loud made it all too real. "You can't say things like that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not when you're with Bettina." "I know," he said, running a hand through his hair, "but I can't help how I feel. I've tried to fight it, but it's like you're under my skin." Liwayway looked away, tears welling in her eyes. "This is wrong, Marvin. Bettina is my best friend. She loves you." "And I thought I loved her," he admitted, his voice cracking. "But then you came into my life, and everything changed. I don't know how to deal with this, Liwayway." Her tears spilled over, and she shook her head. "We can't do this. We can't hurt her like this." Marvin reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a jolt through her. "I'm not asking you to betray her. I just need to know, do you feel the same way?" She hesitated, torn between her loyalty to Bettina and the emotions she could no longer deny. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes." After their conversation, Marvin drove Liwayway home, but neither of them could bring themselves to say goodbye. They sat in the car outside her apartment, the air thick with unspoken words. "I don't know what to do," Liwayway admitted, her voice shaky. Marvin reached over and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. "We'll figure it out. Together." The weight of his words hung between them. She wanted to believe him, to trust that they could navigate this impossible situation, but the reality of their circumstances loomed over them. Before she could respond, Marvin leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a tentative kiss. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The world outside the car faded away, and all that mattered was the warmth of his touch, the softness of his lips. But as quickly as it began, the kiss ended. Liwayway pulled away, her heart pounding in her chest. "This isn't right," she said, her voice barely audible. "I know," Marvin replied, his voice filled with regret, "but I don't regret it." Tears streamed down her face as she opened the car door and stepped out. She didn't look back as she walked into her building, but the weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on her chest. That night, as she lay in bed, Liwayway couldn't stop thinking about the kiss. It had been everything she had ever dreamed of and more, but it had also shattered her sense of right and wrong. She knew that what they had done would change everything, but she didn't know how to undo the damage. Marvin, too, lay awake in his apartment, his mind racing. He knew he had crossed a line, but he couldn't bring himself to regret it. The memory of Liwayway's lips on his haunted him, filling him with equal parts guilt and longing. As the hours passed, both of them realized that their actions had set them on a path from which there was no turning back. The question was no longer whether they would hurt Bettina, but how much damage their forbidden connection would cause. The days following the kiss were a whirlwind of guilt, confusion, and avoidance. Liwayway did everything in her power to steer clear of both Bettina and Marvin, but it was impossible to escape her thoughts. The memory of Marvin's touch lingered, haunting her every moment. At work, Liwayway buried herself in her tasks, hoping the routine would drown out the chaos in her heart. But even the busiest of days couldn't shield her from Bettina's calls and texts. Her best friend was oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface and chatted as if nothing had changed. One afternoon, Bettina invited Liwayway to lunch. Reluctantly, Liwayway agreed, knowing it would be suspicious if she kept dodging her. They met at a cozy cafe, where Bettina greeted her with a wide smile and a warm hug. "I've missed you," Bettina said, her eyes sparkling. Liwayway forced a smile. "I've just been busy with work." Bettina waved her hand dismissively. "I get it, but we have so much to catch up on. By the way, Marvin told me he's been swamped too. Poor guy's been running around for work and family stuff." Liwayway's heart sank. Hearing Marvin's name from Bettina's lips felt like a stab to the chest. "You're so lucky to have him," Liwayway said, her voice barely above a whisper. Bettina's smile grew even wider. "I know, right? He's not perfect, but he's my Marvin." Liwayway nodded, fighting back tears. She wanted to tell Bettina the truth, to confess her betrayal, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. Instead, she sat there, listening as Bettina gushed about her relationship, all the while feeling like the worst person in the world. That evening, Liwayway decided to go for a walk to clear her mind. The city was bustling, the streets alive with the sounds of laughter and conversation. She wandered aimlessly, hoping the noise would drown out her thoughts. She didn't expect to run into Marvin. He was sitting alone at an outdoor cafe, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked up just as she was about to walk past, their eyes locking for a brief, electrifying moment. "Liwayway," he said, his voice soft but filled with surprise. She hesitated, torn between walking away and joining him. Against her better judgment, she sat down across from him. They sat in silence for a while, the tension between them palpable. Finally, Marvin spoke. "I've been thinking about you," he admitted, his voice heavy with emotion. Liwayway looked down at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. "You shouldn't." "I know," he said, leaning forward, "but I can't help it. Being around you, it's like I can't breathe when you're not there." Her heart ached at his words, but she shook her head. "This isn't right, Marvin. We're hurting Bettina." He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. "I know, but I can't ignore what I feel anymore. Can you?" Tears welled up in her eyes as she pulled her hand away. "We can't do this, Marvin. We'll destroy everything." Before he could respond, she stood up and walked away, leaving him sitting alone in the dim glow of the streetlights. The tension between Liwayway and Marvin reached a breaking point when Bettina invited both of them to a dinner party at her family's estate. Liwayway tried to come up with an excuse to skip the event, but Bettina wouldn't take no for an answer. "You have to come," Bettina insisted. "It wouldn't be the same without you." Liwayway reluctantly agreed, dreading the evening. She spent hours agonizing over what to wear, finally settling on a simple but elegant dress that wouldn't draw too much attention. When she arrived at the estate, Bettina greeted her with a warm hug. Marvin was already there, standing by the bar with a drink in hand. Their eyes met briefly, and Liwayway's heart skipped a beat. Throughout the evening, Liwayway tried to avoid Marvin, but it was impossible. Their paths kept crossing, each encounter more charged than the last. At one point, they found themselves alone on the balcony, the sounds of laughter and music muffled by the closed doors behind them. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I needed to talk to you," he said, stepping closer. "We're at a party, Marvin. This isn't the time or place." "I don't care," he said, his voice low and intense. "I can't keep pretending like nothing's happening between us." Before she could respond, the balcony door opened and Bettina stepped out. She froze when she saw them, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. "What's going on here?" Bettina asked, her voice sharp. Liwayway's heart raced as she scrambled for an explanation. "Nothing. We were just getting some air." Bettina didn't look convinced. "You've been acting weird all night, Liwayway. And Marvin, you've been distant too. Is there something you're not telling me?" Liwayway opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The weight of her guilt was too much to bear. Bettina's eyes darted between them, realization dawning on her face. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It's you, isn't it? You're the reason Marvin's been acting so strange." "Bettina, it's not what you think," Marvin said, stepping forward. "Don't lie to me," Bettina shouted, her voice cracking. "I trusted you both." Tears streamed down her face as she turned and stormed back inside, leaving Liwayway and Marvin alone on the balcony, their world crumbling around them. Bettina's anguished cries echoed in Liwayway's mind long after the dinner party ended. She sat alone in her bedroom, the weight of the confrontation crushing her. Bettina had always been her closest friend, her confidant, her sister in all but blood. And now, Liwayway had destroyed that bond. The next morning, Bettina's silence was deafening. No texts, no calls. For the first time in years, Liwayway felt the void left by her absence. Unable to endure the guilt any longer, Liwayway decided to confront Bettina. She drove to her best friend's apartment, rehearsing an apology in her head. She knew there were no words that could truly mend the damage, but she had to try. When Bettina opened the door, her expression was icy. "What do you want?" Bettina asked, crossing her arms. "I'm sorry," Liwayway said, her voice trembling. "I never meant to hurt you." Bettina laughed bitterly. "You didn't just hurt me, Liwayway. You betrayed me. You were supposed to be my best friend, and you—" her voice broke. "I didn't plan for any of this to happen," Liwayway pleaded. "I swear, I tried to stop it." "You tried to stop it?" Bettina's voice rose. "Then why didn't you just stay away from him? Why didn't you tell me the truth before I had to find out on my own?" Liwayway had no answer. She stood there, tears streaming down her face, as Bettina shook her head. "I can't do this right now," Bettina said, stepping back into her apartment. "Just go." The door closed in Liwayway's face, leaving her standing in the hallway, her heart breaking all over again. Marvin couldn't stay silent any longer. After the disaster at the party, he decided to face Bettina and take responsibility for his actions. He couldn't let Liwayway carry the blame alone. He arrived at Bettina's apartment, his nerves frayed. When she opened the door, her eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" she asked coldly. "We need to talk," Marvin said, stepping inside before she could shut the door. Bettina crossed her arms, glaring at him. "Talk? About what?" About how you stabbed me in the back with my best friend." "Bettina, I'm sorry," Marvin said, his voice heavy with regret. "I never meant for this to happen." "Stop saying that," she snapped. "You and Liwayway keep saying you didn't mean for this to happen, but that doesn't change the fact that it did." Marvin sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, and I take full responsibility. I betrayed you, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But please, don't blame Liwayway. This wasn't her fault." Bettina laughed bitterly. "Oh, so now you're defending her? How noble of you." "I'm not defending what we did," Marvin said, "but I care about her, Bettina. I didn't realize it until it was too late, but I have feelings for her." Bettina's expression twisted with anger and pain. "You have feelings for her? After everything we've been through?" "I didn't mean for it to happen," Marvin said, "but I can't deny it anymore." Bettina stared at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "Get out," she said, her voice trembling. "Bettina, get out," she screamed, pointing to the door. Marvin hesitated, but he knew there was nothing more he could say. He left the apartment, his heart heavy with guilt and regret. Liwayway didn't expect to hear from Bettina again, but a week after their confrontation, she received a text. "We need to talk. Meet me at the cafe." Liwayway's heart raced as she read the message. She arrived at the cafe early, her stomach in knots. When Bettina walked in, her expression was unreadable. They sat across from each other in tense silence until Bettina finally spoke. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Bettina said. "About you, about Marvin, about everything." Liwayway braced herself, unsure of what was coming next. "I hate what you did," Bettina continued. "I hate that you lied to me, that you betrayed me. But I can't hate you forever." Liwayway's eyes widened in surprise. You're willing to forgive me?" Bettina sighed. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet, but I don't want to lose you completely. You've been my best friend for years, and despite everything, I miss you." Tears filled Liwayway's eyes. "I miss you too. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Bettina nodded. "Then start by staying away from Marvin. I can't heal if I have to keep worrying about the two of you." Liwayway swallowed hard, but she nodded. "Okay, I'll stay away from him." They sat in silence for a while, the tension between them slowly easing. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a start. As Liwayway walked away from the cafe, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could begin to rebuild what she had broken. Liwayway thought distancing herself from Marvin would be easier than it was. She had promised Bettina she would stay away, but the ache in her chest was relentless. Every time she saw his name on her phone or caught herself imagining his face, she forced herself to stop. Her days became a routine of distractions. Work, errands, and occasional nights with her siblings filled her time. But no matter how hard she tried to keep herself busy, thoughts of Marvin crept in. One afternoon, while walking through the town plaza, she spotted Marvin from a distance. He was seated on a bench, staring at his phone with a frown etched on his face. Liwayway froze. Part of her wanted to turn around and leave, but another part urged her to approach. She stood there, debating, until Marvin looked up and caught her eye. His expression softened, and he gestured for her to join him. Liwayway hesitated, but her feet moved on their own. She sat down beside him, the tension between them thick. "I thought you were avoiding me," Marvin said after a long silence. "I am," Liwayway admitted, "but I didn't expect to see you here." "I've been coming here a lot lately," Marvin said, staring into the distance. "It's the only place that doesn't remind me of everything." Liwayway nodded, understanding his unspoken words. "How's Bettina?" she asked softly. "She doesn't want to see me," Marvin said, his voice heavy with regret. "Not that I blame her. I hurt her more than anyone ever has." Liwayway looked down at her hands. "I'm sorry. For everything." Marvin turned to her, his gaze searching. "You're not the only one who's sorry, Liwayway. I've made so many mistakes." But one thing I can't regret is how I feel about you." Her heart skipped a beat. "Marvin, we can't." "I know," he interrupted. "I know we can't be together. But I need you to know how much you mean to me." Tears filled Liwayway's eyes. "It doesn't matter how we feel. We've already hurt too many people." Marvin reached for her hand, but she pulled away, standing up abruptly. "We need to stop this. For good." Before he could respond, she walked away, her heart breaking with every step. Bettina sat in her dimly lit apartment, staring at the framed photo of her and Liwayway from happier times. They were both smiling, their arms around each other, unaware of the storm that would one day tear them apart. For days, she had tried to make sense of her feelings. Betrayal, anger, and heartbreak swirled within her, but so did a deep longing for the friendship they had shared. She decided it was time to take control of her life. Bettina pulled out her phone and called Liwayway. Liwayway answered on the third ring. "Bettina? Can you meet me?" Bettina asked, her voice steady. "Of course. Where?" An hour later, they met at a quiet coffee shop. Bettina had chosen a corner table away from prying eyes. When Liwayway arrived, she looked nervous, but Bettina gestured for her to sit. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Bettina began, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "About us, about Marvin, about everything." Liwayway didn't interrupt, sensing that Bettina needed to get this off her chest. "I realize that holding on to this anger isn't helping me. It's only keeping me stuck in the past, and I don't want to be stuck anymore," Bettina said, meeting Liwayway's gaze. Liwayway's throat tightened. "I don't know how to make this right," she admitted. "I don't think you can," Bettina said bluntly. "But I do know that I don't want to lose you completely. You're my best friend, Liwayway. And despite everything, I still care about you." Tears spilled down Liwayway's cheeks. "I care about you too, more than anything." Bettina nodded. "Then let's start over. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But if we're both willing to work at it, maybe we can rebuild what we had." Liwayway reached across the table, her hand trembling as she took Bettina's. "I'll do whatever it takes." For the first time in weeks, Bettina smiled. Meanwhile, Marvin made a decision of his own. He realized that if he truly cared about Liwayway and Bettina, he needed to let them go. He couldn't continue to be a source of pain in their lives. He packed his bags and left the city, leaving behind a letter for each of them. In his letter to Liwayway, he wrote, "You deserve to find peace and happiness, Liwayway. I can't be the man who gives that to you, but I hope you find it someday. I'll always cherish the moments we shared, even if they were fleeting. Take care of yourself, and don't let anyone dim your light." And to Bettina, he wrote, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope one day you can find it in your heart to let go of the anger and pain I caused. You are an incredible woman, Bettina, and you deserve someone who will treat you with the love and respect you deserve. I'm sorry for everything." Marvin's departure marked the beginning of a new chapter for all three of them. It was a painful but necessary step toward healing and growth. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more delightful stories.